welcome back to Life on the Wrist. Hope you guys are doing well. Happy, I think, Wednesday this is going to come out. Today we're going to be discussing a series, continuing a series where we answer some common questions about watches. This one is going to be explaining complications, and this is a continuation of our series where it's called Complications Explained, and today we're going to be discussing the power reserve complication. This is a really cool complication. I think it's an underrated complication, so super excited about that. If you are interested in the other complications that we discussed the GMT in the last one, and the episode before that we discussed the chronograph. So if you are interested in learning about those, they'll probably be in the suggested bar on your YouTube page. Also, we have a playlist, so you can just check those out on there. So that's going to be the topic for today. But before we get into that, if you haven't smashed the like button, I say it every video, so you should just be smashing it as soon as you click on the video. Be sure to do that. Also, the subscribe button is really close by, so hit the subscribe button. Just to kind of explain the kind of backstory behind the power reserve indicator, and why and kind of what it is. So as you probably know, or perhaps you don't know, mechanical watches are made up of screws and gears and levers, and mechanical watches are powered by a coiled spring, which is called a mainspring. And it sits in your watch, and when you wind the watch to give it energy, when you transfer energy into the watch by winding the crown, or by simply moving the watch and having the rotor transfer energy into the watch, that coil ends up being coiled up. And as the watch runs, that coil ends up unwinding. And as it unwinds, the watch ends up not being able to run for as long. That's essentially the power. And a power reserve indicator tells you how much power the watch has until that mainspring coil is completely unwound. So the power reserve indicator at the end of the day is almost just like a petrol indicator, or a battery indicator. If you think about your phone, you have your battery indicator. A power reserve indicator is essentially that, but it is for watches. So it's a really cool and useful indicator, especially if you have a manual wind watch where you have to wind the crown in order to supply power to it. So the power reserve indicator tells you how much power the watch ends up having left. Going back just into the history of the power reserve indicator, I think this is an important part for you to understand, so that you kind of are completely educated on the power reserve. So the earliest power reserve indicators were actually found in clocks and not in watches. They were found in marine chronometers and in railroad pocket watches. If you know, just a little side tangent, if you are interested in learning about an individual who was extremely influential in the creation of a lot of marine chronometers and the literature behind a lot of marine chronometers, be sure to check out our Ferdinand Berthoud video where we discuss him as a legendary figure within watchmaking. He was extremely influential in marine chronometers. But going back to the power reserve indicator, that was the earliest. They were earliest seen in marine chronometers and in railroad pocket watches. But if we're talking about watches here, the first known power reserve indicator is actually seen in a watch from Breguet. This was actually a prototype watch. It was manufactured in 1933, and it was never actually released or produced in mass quantities to be sold to the public. But that was the first known time where a power reserve indicator was seen on a watch. If you want to look at it from a commercial standpoint of when was the first time a watch company produced a power reserve indicator and ended up selling those watches, we can look to the famous and extremely well-known manufacturer Jaeger LeCoultre, or JLC as many people refer to them. The first watch that they introduced with a power reserve indicator was called the Powermatic, and this was introduced in 1948. And this was the first time a watch was put into production with a power reserve indicator and ended up being sold to the public in quantities. So this watch was running off the caliber 481 watch movement, and it included a power reserve indicator, which is obviously a modification to perhaps a base movement, where you end up seeing how much that coil is wound or unwound. And if you look at the Powermatics, a lot of the times their indicator is actually on at the top of the watch by 12 o'clock, and you can see it has colors to indicate how far or how much power you actually have left in the watch. It's almost they basically cut out a little section of the dial, and it gives you some indication of the power reserve. So that's kind of the history of the power reserve. I'll kind of talk about different ways that you can lay out the power reserve indicator. So there are many different ways that you can do this. You can do it like the Powermatic, where you have a cutout of the dial and you end up having colors that indicate, yes, you are completely wound up and completely not. I actually really like this way of laying out the power reserve. I think it's a nice way to add a little bit of color to a dial that oftentimes is very simple. That's one way. Another way is to have a power reserve hand on the dial that ends up increasing and decreasing as the power, as the coil winds and unwinds. This, you can find a really nice version of this in the Alangan and Alanga 1, which we actually discussed in our previous video released on our channel, so be sure to check that out if you want to learn about the history of the Langa 1. But you can see a really beautiful power reserve indicator on the Langa 1, where as you wind the watch, it ends up increasing, and as you unwind the watch, it ends up decreasing. So that's another way that you can lay this out, and I actually, I really like the way power reserve indicators are laid out just in general, but I will say this is a little bit more in line with very traditional watchmaking, very, having an extra hand kind of makes you feel like it's just another, it's just like an hour's hand or a second's hand or a chronograph hand. I kind of like when there's a cutout, because it's a different dimension that you can look at the watch at. So that's another way that you can lay out the power reserve. And then the last way that I can think of right now is actually having it in a 3D variation of it. So one of my favorite watch companies is MB&F, and one of my favorite watches from them, they're an independent watch company. One of my favorite ways that they laid out the power reserve indication on one of the watches is actually having a vertical power reserve indicator. So one of my favorite watches from them is from their Legacy machine. It is the Legacy machine number 1. This one has two dials, and then right in between them you can see this hand that ends up going up and down, and you can see these little tick marks on this little indicator that's 3D. Now, MB&F is known for creating, kind of making watch movements a little bit more 3D and having you be able to see each of the components. But this power reserve indicator is actually vertical. So as you wind the watch, the lever ends up going up, and as the watch uncoils and the power is used, it ends up going down. And this takes inspiration from the Marine Sextant, which is another completely different topic that we could discuss when it comes to watches, but we can get to that in another video. But that's another way that you can do it, and I think that also kind of gives you a little bit more. It almost humanizes and makes you connect with it a little bit more, because it's actually increasing and decreasing, kind of like like a breath. Like the watch is almost breathing as it increases, and then as it decreases, it's letting energy release, and you kind of get a little bit more of a connection with it. So that's another way you can have a power reserve indicator laid out. I'm sure there are so many other different ways that you can have the power reserve indication on a watch. Let me know in the comments what your favorite types of layouts for the power reserve indicator is. I'd love to hear what they are. I'm sure there are some other variations, not just these 3, but let me know in the comments. Also, if you have some complications that you want me to do right in this, want me to discuss and explain, let me know, because I want to make sure we're making this for you guys. We'll go through all the complications. We'll eventually weave our way through the complications, but if there are ones that I should, maybe bump up on the list, let me know. Also, if you haven't seen our videos about the GMT or the chronograph, be sure to check those out. It's a similar format, kind of explaining what it is, the history of it, and then different ways that it can be laid out. So be sure to check those out. And if you've made it this far and you haven't already, be sure to smash that like button for us. It really does help us out, as well as subscribe to our channel for other videos. I'm going to be away, I believe last week I was away, so if you didn't hear from me last week, I apologize for that, but you got videos from us because we made sure that we had content for you guys. So hope you enjoyed those videos as well. Also, this is going to be a huge plug for our social networks. If you are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and most recently TikTok, be sure to check us out at Life on the Wrist. We post there basically daily, and we interact with you a little bit more there. We've revamped our social media over the last couple weeks, and that's what That's why we're doing a little bit of plugging here, but I think it's totally warranted because these are my videos and I can essentially do what we want. So be sure to check us out there. Also, if you like to listen to watch podcasts, be sure to head over to wherever you listen to your podcast. We are making a podcast now. It's called the Life on the Wrist podcast, so be sure to check that out as well. And with that said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time.